The room went quiet when he walked in, not because of the wheelchair or the medals on his chest or even the way his jaw was set like stone. It went quiet because of what he did next. He looked past the attending physician, past the department head standing with his arms crossed, past every white coat in that hallway, and he raised his hand to his brow. A slow, deliberate salute, directed at the woman in scrubs standing near the supply cart, the one they had been laughing about that morning. The one they called the new nurse. She didn't smile, she didn't cry, she just nodded once quietly and went back to work. That was the moment I understood everything I had missed. I had worked at Hargrove Regional Medical Center for 11 years by the time any of this happened. 11 years in the same department, the same hallways, the same rhythms, trauma and surgical support. It was not glamorous work, not in the way people imagine when they picture hospitals on television. It was long shifts, short breaks, difficult patients, and the kind of exhaustion that does not leave you even after a full night of sleep. But I was good at it. I knew that without arrogance. I had earned my place there slowly, shift by shift, and I took quiet pride in that. The department ran on hierarchy. That was simply the reality of it. At the top were the attending physicians, Dr. Callum Reese, Dr. Patricia Ockhaffer, and Dr. Jerome Hatch. Below them, the residents and fellows who cycled through every few years, eager and anxious and always trying to impress. Then the senior nurses, of which I was one. Then the support staff. Everyone knew their place. Everyone understood the unspoken rules. You deferred upward. You did not question loudly. You did not make the physicians look incompetent in front of patients or colleagues, even when they were. I was not someone who pushed against the current. I want to be honest about that now. I was not a rebel or a whistleblower or someone who stayed up at night troubled by the system. I believed in the system. I had seen it work. I had watched good physicians save lives and good nurses catch errors that would have cost patients dearly. I trusted that the structure existed for a reason, and I operated within it comfortably, even gratefully. My relationships in the department were solid. I was close with two other senior nurses, Margaret, who had been there longer than anyone, and Dion, who was younger than me but exceptionally sharp. We ate lunch together most days. We covered each other's patients when one of us needed a break. We did not socialize much outside the hospital. The hours made that difficult, but inside those walls, we were a unit. I trusted them. I trusted most of the people I worked with, at least enough to function. Dr. Reese was the one I trusted most among the physicians. He had a reputation for being demanding, but I had always found him to be fair in the way that mattered. He expected excellence, and when you delivered it, he acknowledged it. Not warmly, not with praise, but with a kind of steady respect that I valued more than praise anyway. We had worked together through some difficult cases, a multi-vehicle accident that brought 11 patients in a single hour, a pediatric emergency that none of us had slept well after. And in those moments, he had always been exactly who you needed him to be. I tell you all of this because I need you to understand what I was before any of this happened. I was not naive. I was not careless. I was a person who had built something real over 11 years, who had earned trust and extended trust, and who believed, genuinely believed, that the environment I worked in, while imperfect, was fundamentally decent. I was wrong about that. Not about everything. Not about Margaret or Dion or even about some of what Dr. Reese was capable of in a crisis. But about the nature of the place, about what it protected and what it quietly punished, about the difference between order and justice. I was deeply, consequentially wrong. The new nurse arrived on a Tuesday in early March. I remember the day because it had snowed the night before lightly, just enough to make the parking lot treacherous, and I had arrived irritable and cold. Her name was Elena Vasquez. She was 34 years old according to the department roster, though she looked younger in person, composed, lean, with dark eyes that moved carefully around a room before she spoke. She introduced herself to the charge nurse without any particular performance of friendliness or eagerness. Just her name, her hand extended, her eyes steady. I noticed her the way you notice someone who does not quite fit the mold of what you expected. Nothing alarming, nothing significant. Just a small note at the back of my mind that this person was different in some way I had not yet identified. I went back to my patients. The morning moved forward. That small note stayed where it was, unexamined, waiting. The joke started within the first week. That is not an exaggeration. It was fast, and it was casual, the way cruelty often is when it does not yet recognize itself as cruelty. It began in the break room. Dr. Hatch was pouring coffee when Alina walked past the window in the hallway, and he said something low and amused to Dr. Ockhaffer about how the hiring standards had apparently changed. Dr. Ockhaffer laughed, not loudly, not with malice on her face, just the comfortable laugh of someone sharing a private joke with a colleague. I was at the counter making notes on a chart. I heard it. I did not respond. I told myself it was nothing. Physicians talked like that. It was not polite, but it was not unusual. By the end of the second week, I had heard variations of the same tone a dozen times. Comments about Alina's age. Comments about her quietness, not that she was shy, but that she didn't seem to understand how things worked here. One of the residents, a young man named Callum who was clearly trying to mirror Dr. Reese's manner, said loudly in the nursing station one afternoon that the new hire seemed confused about what her job actually was. A few people laughed. Alina was not present. She was down the hall with a patient. I want to say I felt immediate discomfort. I want to say I recognized it for what it was. But the truth is more complicated. I felt something, a low-level friction, a faint wrongness, but I smoothed it over almost as quickly as it arrived. I had seen new staff struggle to integrate before. I had seen cliques form and personalities clash and people wash out because the department was genuinely demanding. I told myself this was the beginning of a pattern I had seen before, and that Alina would either find her footing or she would not. What I did not let myself examine was the specific texture of the comments. They were not about her competence, not really. No one had seen her work closely enough yet to judge that. They were about her presence, the way she carried herself, the fact that she did not laugh at their jokes or fill silence with nervous conversation. She was quiet in a way that made certain people uncomfortable, and they were translating that discomfort into contempt before she had done anything to deserve it. I noticed that Margaret seemed uneasy about it too, though she said nothing directly. I caught her watching Alina in the hallway one morning with an expression I could not fully read, something between concern and caution. I thought about asking her what she was thinking. I did not. We were busy. The moment passed. Alina herself gave no indication of feeling any of it. She moved through her shifts with a kind of focused economy, nothing wasted, nothing performed. She completed her tasks. She spoke to patients in a low, unhurried voice that I noticed seemed to calm them in a way that was not common or easy to teach. She did not seek approval. She did not appear to need it. There was one moment, early in her third week, that lodged itself in my memory. We had a post-operative patient, an older man recovering from abdominal surgery who became agitated and confused during the night shift. I was not present, but Dion told me about it the next morning. Alina had been the one to respond first. She had spoken to him, assessed him, and had quietly adjusted his positioning and his oxygen before the on-call physician had even been paged. By the time the physician arrived, the patient was calm and his stats had stabilized. The physician took credit for the assessment in his notes. Alina said nothing about it. Dion told me this with a strange look on his face, not quite admiration, not quite alarm. She just let it go, he said, like it wasn't even worth the fight. I remember thinking that was unusual. Most people, when their work was taken from them, at least showed some flicker of resentment. Alina had shown nothing. Either she did not care or she was accustomed to it. At the time, I could not tell which. Now I think I know exactly which one it was. The case that first made me pay real attention came in the 5th week of Alina's placement. A construction worker, mid-40s, brought in after a fall from scaffolding. He had sustained what looked initially like blunt trauma to the chest and a suspected fracture of the right femur. The ER had stabilized him and sent him up to us for pre-surgical assessment and monitoring. The resident on duty was performing the intake assessment when Alina entered the room to prep the IV line. I was nearby, updating another patient's chart, close enough to observe without being in the way. The resident, not Callum this time, a quieter one named Priya, was moving through the standard checklist efficiently. She noted the chest contusions, confirmed the femur fracture, checked his airway and blood pressure. Alina had finished the IV line and was about to leave when she paused. She looked at the patient's face, not the chart, the patient's face, and then she looked at his fingers. She stood there for 2 or 3 seconds without moving. Then she said quietly to Priya, "Has anyone assessed for a tension pneumothorax? His trachea is shifted slightly left and his right breath sounds are diminished." Priya looked at her for a moment. There was a subtle shift in the room, the kind of shift that happens when someone outside the expected authority says something that requires an immediate decision about whether to take it seriously. Priya looked back at the patient. She reached for her stethoscope. She listened. Her expression changed. She ordered the X-ray. The X-ray confirmed it. The patient was treated immediately and was in surgery within 40 minutes. If the pneumothorax had progressed undetected for another hour, the outcome would have been very different. No one said thank you to Alina. What I heard instead, later that afternoon in the break room, was Dr. Hatch telling Dr. Reese that it was lucky the resident caught the pneumothorax in time. He did not mention Alina. He presented the story as an example of good resident work. Dr. Reese nodded and said something about the value of thorough assessment. I was standing near the door. I did not correct the story. I want to be clear about that. I heard a lie formed from omission, and I did not interrupt it. I told myself it was not my place. I told myself Priya would say something if she felt strongly. I told myself a lot of things that allowed me to move away from the door and down the hallway and back to my patients. But I could not stop thinking about the moment Alina had paused. The way her eyes had moved, not frantically, not with performance, but with the calm, systematic scan of someone who had trained to look for exactly those things under exactly those conditions. It was the look of someone who had done assessments in environments far more chaotic than a hospital room. I could not have told you then what I meant by that. It was instinct more than knowledge. Something in the precision and the stillness of her that did not match the title on her badge. Over the next 2 weeks, I began to watch more deliberately. What I saw was a pattern. Alina consistently caught things, medication interactions, subtle changes in patient responsiveness, early signs of post-operative complication that should have been caught by the physicians but were not. She never announced these catches. She reported them through the appropriate channels, quietly, to the relevant residents or charge nurses, and then she stepped back. She did not advocate for credit. She did not keep score visibly, but the physicians noticed her in the worst way. Dr. Hatch began making comments with a sharper edge. He questioned her documentation in team meetings, not with specific errors, but with a generalizing skepticism. Are we confident in these observations? That made clear he was not questioning the observation, but the observer. Dr. Ockhaffer stopped acknowledging her in the hallway. Dion said to me one evening as we were finishing a shift, "Something is off about how they're treating her. She keeps being right and they keep acting like she's a problem." He said it quietly, almost to himself, and then he went to get his coat. I stood there for a moment in the empty nursing station. He was right. I knew he was right. And I still did not say it aloud, not yet. That silence had a cost, and I was about to find out exactly what it was. I said something, finally, in the 7th week. It was not brave. It was not even particularly direct, but I said it. I waited until I had a quiet moment with Dr. Reese, a real one, not a corridor exchange, and I raised it carefully. I told him I had noticed some friction around the new staff member, Alina Vasquez, and that some of the comments in team settings seemed to be creating a climate that might affect department morale. I used careful language, neutral language. I did not say the word unfair. I did not say the word discrimination. I said friction and climate and morale. He listened. He did not interrupt, which I had taken as a good sign. Then he set down his pen and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as patient disappointment, the look of someone who expected better reasoning from a person they had previously respected. He said that the new nurse had been placed with the department without adequate prior consultation, that her credentials were unconventional, and that it was natural for an experienced team to need time to calibrate trust with a new colleague. He said the department had standards, and those standards applied to everyone equally, and that if I was interpreting the calibration process as hostility, I might be projecting something that was not there. That was the word he used, projecting. I left his office feeling as though I had made an error, not a large one, but an error, that I had raised something prematurely, without sufficient evidence, and had perhaps colored his impression of my own judgment in the process. I did not examine that feeling carefully in the moment. I simply absorbed it and moved on. What happened next was more subtle. I began to notice that my own standing in the department shifted slightly in the weeks after that conversation. Nothing overt, no reprimands, no formal friction. But I was consulted less in the informal conversations that happened around decisions. When I made observations in team briefings, they were acknowledged more briefly. Small things. The kind of things that could absolutely be coincidence or could absolutely not be. Margaret noticed. She came to me one afternoon and said carefully that she had heard I had spoken to Dr. Reese about the situation with Alina. She asked me gently whether I was sure that had been wise. I asked her what she meant. She said only that things had a way of being remembered in this department and that certain conversations were better left unheld. Then she changed the subject. I understood what she was telling me. She was warning me without committing to the warning, giving me information while maintaining plausible distance from it. I appreciated it and resented it in equal measure. Meanwhile, Alina continued to work. She did not appear to be aware of my conversation with Dr. Reese, or if she was, she gave no sign. She was exactly as she had been from the first day, precise, quiet, present. She asked no favors. She made no appeals. She did not appear to be building alliances or managing her reputation or doing any of the social labor that most people in a hostile environment eventually begin doing out of sheer self-preservation. That continued to unsettle me in a way I could not quite articulate. Most people under that kind of sustained low-level dismissal begin to change. They become either more aggressive or more withdrawn. They start to make mistakes because the psychological weight of feeling unseen affects concentration. Alina did neither. Her work remained exactly as clean as it had been from the beginning. Dion pulled me aside one morning after a particularly uncomfortable team briefing in which Dr. Hatch had interrupted Alina twice without cause and dismissed her notation on a patient's chart with a wave of his hand. Dion said, low and tight with controlled frustration, "They're not going to stop. They've decided she doesn't belong here and they're going to keep at it until she leaves or breaks." I asked him if he was going to say something. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you?" I did not answer. I wanted to say yes. I felt the yes in my chest, the moral weight of it pressing upward. But I had been in that department for 11 years. I had built something there. I knew what it cost to become a problem, and I had just been shown quietly by Dr. Reese and by Margaret's careful warning that the cost was real. I said nothing. I went back to my patients. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. There is no right moment. That is the thing I should have known. There is only the moment in front of you and what you choose to do with it. The right moment, or something close enough to it, arrived without my choosing it. It arrived in the form of a man on a gurney being rushed through the corridor at a speed that told everyone within visual range that the situation was critical. He was brought in on a Thursday afternoon in the 9th week of Alina's placement. A veteran, we were told by the paramedics, retired military, multiple prior surgeries related to combat injuries, currently experiencing acute respiratory distress in the context of what appeared to be a post-surgical infection. His name was Commander David Harrell. The paramedics were tense in a way that went beyond standard urgency. They spoke about him with a kind of deference I did not often see from EMS staff. The trauma bay was activated. Dr. Reese led the response, with 2 residents flanking him and several nurses, including myself, moving to station. Alina was assigned to monitoring. She positioned herself at the head of the gurney, close to the patient's airway, her eyes doing that careful, systematic scan I had come to recognize. Commander Harrell was conscious, but barely. His oxygen saturation was low and dropping. Dr. Reese was assessing and calling orders, chest X-ray, blood cultures, broad-spectrum antibiotics. The room was moving with the particular controlled urgency of experienced trauma staff. It was loud but organized. And then Alina said, clearly and without raising her voice above what was necessary to be heard, "His previous surgical notes indicate a documented sensitivity to cephalosporins. The antibiotic ordered is a cephalosporin derivative." The room did not stop, but something in it shifted. Dr. Reese looked up from his assessment. There was a beat of silence in which several things happened simultaneously. The resident who had been preparing the antibiotic stopped. The charge nurse looked at Dr. Reese, and Dr. Reese looked at Alina. He said, "How do you know his prior surgical notes?" She said, "They were forwarded with the transfer documentation. Page 3. Someone picked up the transfer documentation, turned to page 3, read for 4 seconds, then said quietly, "She's correct." The order was changed. A different antibiotic was prepared and administered. Commander Harrell's condition stabilized over the next 90 minutes. He did not go into anaphylactic shock. He remained alive. The room reconfigured itself around that moment without fully acknowledging it. People moved on. Orders were updated. The clinical work continued. But something had changed in the texture of the room, and everyone who had been present could feel it even if no one named it. Afterward, Priya, the resident who had confirmed the pneumothorax 6 weeks earlier, found the transfer documentation and spent several minutes looking through it. She came to me, not to any of the attending physicians, and she showed me something on the back page of the packet. It was a single line in the referring physician's notes that referenced Commander Harrell's preference to be treated by providers with military medical experience if available, and a handwritten notation that read, "Patient reports positive prior care experience with E. Vasquez, former combat medic, Spec Ops Support 3 deployments." Priya looked at me. I looked at the page. "Former combat medic, Special Operations Support, 3 deployments." I read it 3 times. I stood there in the supply corridor holding a transfer packet while the weight of 11 weeks rearranged itself in my understanding. A combat medic attached to special operations does not work in a comfortable environment with full equipment and predictable patience. They work in conditions where the margin for error is measured in seconds, where resources are limited, where the person bleeding in front of you has no other option but you. Skills developed in that context do not resemble the skills developed in a hospital training program. They exceed them in some specific and critical ways, precisely because the consequences of failure were so much more absolute. Alina Vasquez had walked into our department, this department that prided itself on its standards and its hierarchy and its calibration of trust, with a depth of clinical experience that none of the people mocking her possessed, and she had said nothing about it. She had simply done her work. I asked Priya if she was going to say something to the attending physicians. Priya said she thought someone should look at Alina's full placement file. She said it with careful neutrality, the kind that meant she was not willing to be the one to do it herself. I held the transfer packet. I thought about Dr. Reese's office and the word projecting. I thought about Margaret's warning. I thought about Dion's question, "Are you?" I walked to the charge nurse's station. I asked that Alina Vasquez's full placement and credentialing file be formally reviewed and shared with department leadership. I handed over the transfer packet. Then I went back to my patients because the shift was not over and people still needed care, and that at least was something I knew how to do. The file review took 3 days. During those 3 days, the department operated as it always had on the surface: patients, rounds, shift changes, the particular choreography of a busy trauma unit. Beneath that surface, something was moving. I do not know exactly how word traveled, but it did, as it always does in contained institutional environments. By the second day, the senior residents knew that a file review had been requested. By the third day, the attending physicians knew. I know this because of the way Dr. Hatch looked at me across the nursing station on Wednesday morning. A look that was not quite anger, not quite alarm, but something compressed and assessing. He held it for 2 seconds and then looked away. That was all, but it was enough. The file came back on Thursday. I was not given a formal briefing. I was a senior nurse, not an administrator, and the formal response went through channels above my position. But Dion had a contact in the administrative office, and through that contact, the outline reached us. Alina Vasquez held a nursing license, as the department records had shown. That was accurate. What the original intake had not captured, or had captured and not surfaced, was the fuller picture of her background. 8 years of military service. 4 of those years as a special operations combat medic. Deployments in environments with active casualties. Post-service medical training, continuing education certifications, and an additional qualification in trauma assessment that was, by most clinical benchmarks, equivalent to a physician's assistant certification. She had chosen to enter civilian healthcare at the nursing level because the licensing timeline for higher certification was longer, and she had not wanted to wait. She had simply begun working, at whatever level the system would admit her, because she did not require the title to do the work. She had never volunteered this information. She had not been asked. The department's response to this information was not what I had hoped for, and looking back now, I cannot say I am surprised. Dr. Reese called a team meeting that was framed as a discussion of departmental integration practices. It was, in effect, a meeting about how to handle the fact that they had been wrong. Dr. Hatch spoke first. He said the issue was not about background but about process, that credentials, however impressive, needed to be verified and communicated through proper channels, and that Alina's failure to disclose her full history was itself a form of professional lapse. He used the word transparency. He said that the department needed to be able to trust its members, and trust required openness. I sat in that meeting and I listened to this. I looked around the room. Several residents were looking at the table. Priya was looking at her hands. Margaret was looking at Dr. Reese with an expression I could not read clearly. I thought about what Dr. Hatch had just said. I thought about the patient who would have gone into anaphylactic shock without Alina's intervention. I thought about the construction worker with the undetected tension pneumothorax. I thought about the post-operative patient whose restlessness had been correctly managed at 3 in the morning. I thought about all the things Alina had noticed and quietly corrected and never taken credit for. And I thought about the word transparency being used by a man who had spent 9 weeks misrepresenting the source of correct clinical observations to his colleagues. I said calmly that I was not certain the concern about transparency applied in one direction only. The room went very still. Dr. Reese looked at me. I held his gaze. I said that to my knowledge, several significant clinical catches had been made by Alina Vasquez over the preceding weeks, and that the attribution of those catches had not always been accurate in the way it was communicated upward. I said I thought that was relevant to a conversation about transparency and trust. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Dr. Hatch said something about the meeting having a specific scope, and Dr. Reese said they would take my observation under advisement, and the meeting moved forward. But it did not move forward as it had been designed to. Something had cracked visibly in the surface of things, and everyone in the room had heard it. After the meeting, 3 residents came to find me separately over the course of the afternoon. Each of them, in their own careful way, confirmed something they had witnessed or known. Priya formalized her account of the pneumothorax intervention in a written notation. The notes went to administration. Alina was not in any of these meetings. She was on shift. She was doing her work. That evening, Commander Harrell, who had been moved to a standard care room as his condition improved, asked a floor nurse to pass a message to the staff who had been in the trauma bay on the day of his admission. The message was short. He said he was aware that someone in the room had recognized a medication conflict that would have been serious, and he wanted it noted that this type of attention was not something he took for granted, having been in situations where the difference between that level of care and its absence was measured in lives. The floor nurse wrote it down and put it in the communications log. Administration received it the following morning. By afternoon, it had moved to the department director's desk. The department director, I was told, read it twice. The next morning, Commander Harrell asked to see Alina personally. I did not sleep well that week. I want to set that detail down because it is true and because it matters for understanding where I was in myself by the time that Thursday arrived. Each night I lay in the particular quiet of my apartment, and I turned the past 11 weeks over in my mind with the deliberate, unwanted attention of someone who cannot stop examining a wound. Not because the examination was useful. It was not useful. The decisions I had failed to make were already made permanently in the form of their absence. I could not go back. I could only sit with the weight of what my silence had cost, or more precisely, what it had nearly cost. The construction worker could have died. Not metaphorically, not in a worst-case scenario sense. He could have literally died in our care, while the people responsible for his care argued over who got credit for his treatment, and allowed the person who had caught a life-threatening complication to be dismissed as someone who did not understand how things worked. Commander Harrell could have gone into anaphylactic shock in a trauma bay full of experienced medical professionals, because a medication order had been issued without adequate cross-referencing of his history, and the person in the room who had read page 3 of the transfer documentation carefully enough to catch. It was someone those same professionals had spent 9 weeks publicly and privately belittling. I thought about what it means to work alongside someone every day and choose not to see them. Not because you are unintelligent or malicious. I do not believe I am either of those things, but because seeing them fully would require you to act, and acting would cost you something, and you had already decided quietly in the space between your values and your habits that your comfort was worth more than their dignity. That is a hard thing to sit with. I sat with it for 4 nights. There was a moment on the second night, around 2 in the morning, when I understood something about the specific quality of Alina's silence. Why she had never announced herself, never appealed to be seen differently, never corrected the record when her work was taken. She was not passive. She was not resigned. She had made a calculation, based on something she understood about systems like ours, that the information would eventually reveal itself, and that any effort she made to accelerate that revelation would be used against her as evidence of the very arrogance they were already accusing her of. She had been in environments before where survival depended on reading a situation clearly and acting accordingly, not on instinct or frustration, but on assessment. She had assessed our department correctly. She had been patient, and she had been right. I thought about the 3 deployments. I thought about what a combat medic attached to special operations actually does, what they see, what they lose, what they carry back with them. I thought about what it would mean to come home from that, to re-enter civilian life, to walk into a place like Hargrove Regional and start at the beginning because the system requires it, and then to face the particular pettiness of people who have never been tested in any real sense deciding that you are beneath their consideration. And I thought about my own role in that, because I had known something was wrong. Not from the first day. I am not rewriting my own history to flatter myself. But from the pneumothorax, from the moment in the break room, from Dion's voice when he said they've decided she doesn't belong here, I had known in the way that people know things they are not ready to act on, and I had folded that knowledge away and continued going about my day. There's a kind of cowardice that looks nothing like cowardice from the inside. It looks like pragmatism. It looks like patience. It looks like knowing your own limits and respecting the reality of your environment. I had given my silence many names, and none of them had been honest. On the 4th night, I stopped trying to justify any of it. I let it be what it was. A failure. Not a catastrophic one, not one that could not be partially addressed, but a failure in the most personal sense. A moment when I had the information and the position and the relationship with the physicians to say something real, and I had chosen not to, and that choice had come from fear dressed up as wisdom. I got up before my alarm on Thursday. I dressed. I drove to the hospital in the cold. I walked through the entrance and down the corridor toward the department, and I felt the particular clarity that sometimes comes on the far side of a week you cannot undo. I did not know yet what would happen that morning. I did not know about the wheelchair or the hallway or what I was about to witness. I only knew that I was going to be different in how I moved through that place, Starting that day, even if I could not yet define exactly what different meant. I found out within the hour. Commander Harrell came in a wheelchair, accompanied by a younger officer in uniform. He had requested to visit the floor before his discharge appointment with his outpatient care team. The charge nurse had been notified. The department knew he was coming in a general way, a former patient returning to thank the staff, which was not unusual, and so no one had assigned it any particular significance. He came through the main corridor of the department at just past 9 in the morning. Dr. Reese and Dr. Hatch were both present, which was somewhat coincidental. They were reviewing a case at the nursing station and had not moved on yet. Several residents were nearby. I was updating charts at the secondary station, positioned with a clear sightline down the corridor. Commander Harrell moved slowly. His injuries had been significant, and the wheelchair reflected a recovery that was not yet complete. But his posture, even seated, had a quality I can only describe as occupying space with intention, the posture of someone who has made decisions under pressure and carries that history in their body. He came to a stop in the middle of the corridor. He looked at the assembled staff, the attendings, the residents, the nurses. He looked carefully the way Alina looked carefully, with the particular attention of someone trained to assess a room in full rather than in pieces. And then he looked past all of them down the corridor to where Alina was standing near the supply cart, her back partially turned as she took inventory. He said her name, not loudly, just clearly. She turned. He raised his hand to his brow. The salute was slow and deliberate and held for several seconds. The kind of salute that is not a greeting. The kind that is a statement. Alina did not smile. She did not cry. She stood straight, and she nodded once with a gravity that matched his entirely, and then she turned back to the supply cart. The corridor was silent for what felt like a very long time. Commander Harrell then spoke to the room briefly without theater. He said he had been in a lot of medical facilities over the years, and that the quality of care he had received in this unit had been notable, and that he wanted to specifically acknowledge a member of the team who had identified a critical error in his treatment in real time and prevented a serious complication. He gave Alina's full name. He gave the specific clinical detail of what she had caught. He was precise and unhurried and left no ambiguity about who he was talking about or what she had done. Dr. Reese said something about the team effort involved in patient care. Commander Harrell looked at him with an expression that was not hostile but was completely without deference, and he said evenly that he was familiar with team effort and that he was describing a specific individual action and that he wanted it to be on the record. Then he thanked the charge nurse, nodded to the room, and was wheeled back down the corridor. The administrative review that followed was formal and documented. It had been already underway before Commander Harrell's visit, the file review, the resident statements, my own notation. But his account added a layer of specificity and external credibility that made the review undeniable. 3 physicians were placed on administrative review for documented misattribution of clinical observations, creation of a hostile team environment, and failure to review incoming staff credentials through the required process. 2 of them received formal notations in their department records. 1 was referred to a secondary review process. None of them lost their licenses. I want to be accurate about that. The consequences were real, but they were institutional consequences, the kind that affect standing and record without ending careers. Whether that is proportionate to what was done, I genuinely do not know. I am not the one who decides that. Alina was formally offered a position at a higher clinical level, commensurate with her actual qualifications. She was given the option of transitioning to a trauma assessment role that matched her training. She accepted. She did not make a statement. She did not give an interview to the internal communications newsletter that wanted to profile her. She sent a brief email to administration confirming her acceptance of the new role, and she returned to work on Monday as scheduled. Margaret came to me that week and said, quietly, that she owed me an apology for the warning she had given me. I told her I understood why she had given it. She said understanding a thing and it being right were not the same. I agreed with her. The department did not transform overnight. I want to be honest about that because the kind of story that ends with transformation in an institution is usually leaving something out. What changed was slower and less clean than that. Some things were better. The team meetings had a different quality, more careful, less hierarchical in the reflexive way that hierarchy had previously operated. The residents asked questions they might not have asked before. There was more caution around the easy assumptions, more willingness to follow a clinical observation wherever it led regardless of who had made it. Some things were the same. Institutions are slow, and the people inside them are shaped by forces that do not disappear because something significant happened. There were still moments of dismissal, Still moments where I saw the old patterns beginning to form. Still the constant low friction of people protecting their sense of where they stood. Alina came in every morning the same way she had come in from the first day. Early, quiet, her eyes moving through a room with the careful attention that I now understood was not personality but training, the trained observation of someone who had learned that what you miss can kill the person you are trying to save. She did not hold court. She did not gather allies or tell her story or accept the implicit invitation to become an example of something. She did the work. She was very good at the work. That was what she had always been, from the first Tuesday in March, when she introduced herself to the charge nurse with her hand extended and her eyes steady. I thought sometimes, watching her, about the 3 deployments, about what she had seen and carried and continued to carry in a way that was not visible unless you knew to look for it. About how she had walked into a place that had decided to dismiss her and had simply, quietly, continued to be exactly who she was until the truth of that became undeniable. That is not triumph. It is not resolution. It is something harder and more honest than either of those things. It is what it looks like when a person refuses to be made smaller than they are. And the rest of us, those of us who watched, who hesitated, who waited for the right moment that never announced itself cleanly, we have to live inside that truth now and decide what to do with it. That is where I am. That is where this ends.